So the last thing I'd want to talk about then would be race in relation to the games I play. And the challenge here, I would say, is that unlike, let's say, for heterosexism in games, where that's often verbalized and that's often accepted as normal, to do that. And in the same way, if we're talking about gender, if someone, if I should say specifically, if like a male male identified person playing a game is called like a bitch or something by another male, that's often not seen as very problematic, or at least it's not called out in the games often. In contrast, for race, if someone were to use like any sort of language that attacks a person's race or that could be clearly marked as racist, that would almost certainly be called out by just about everyone playing the game. Or at least that's how I understand it and would see it. And I don't think that's necessarily true just within my own personal circles of friends. I think that's actually speaking to the broader context outside of games too, where it's a lot easier for someone to kind of get away with saying heterosexist or sexist things, but to not have the same liberty with racist things. And in terms of what I have seen in games, again, very few instances where anyone would say explicitly racist stuff. More commonly, there's kind of an absence of race from the discussion altogether. I think I might actually have one example that might be best for this. So there's one game in particular that brought out race most visibly, and I think I might focus on that, Call of Duty. And I bring up that example because, at least in some of the editions, the opposing sides would be the US and then Taliban fighters. So this was actually a pretty common trend that had been going on and may still be going on in a lot of online shooting games, to have this dynamic and to have these two opposing sides. In these games, people do feel comfortable talking about race and talking about nationality and associated religions with those all at the same time, and being aggressive about how they're going to wipe out, let's say they wipe out the Taliban, for example, and so on. But it's always kind of neutralized, at least as they see it, by being all about the game. So any sort of like aggression directed towards race is kind of neatly packaged away as just part of how you normally play the game. Which to an extent is true, but it does leave open questions about how people are thinking about race when they're playing it, because it's often left unspoken otherwise. Even in Call of Duty, for example, you rarely will hear anyone discuss race outside of the context of US versus Taliban. So there's very little discussion about like immigration, for example, in any of the games I've played at any time, even though that's a discussion that this same age group that I'm playing with would discuss elsewhere. And then in terms of identification for myself, I'd say I've been pretty racially ambiguous with my characters. I don't often think about it too much when I'm deciding the character, and I'll be pretty flexible. Sometimes I'll play a character that's white, sometimes I won't. Sometimes I don't have much choice because of the way the content is designed, so particular in-game races will have various skin tones available to them, and sometimes those skin tones are highly restricted. On the one hand, there might just not be, like for example, a lighter or darker skin tone for a given in-game race. On the other hand, there might be those options, but in my personal opinion, I might find that the color scheme is just like, it doesn't look natural to me, so I don't choose it. And I think this was particularly true, I'm thinking of an example right now in World of Warcraft, where you can be a blood elf, but the color palette available makes it so that I didn't want to be a dark-skinned blood elf, not because I didn't want to be darker skinned, but because I found that it did not match the aesthetic of the character at all. They didn't make the color scheme very wide, basically, for what you could choose there. So when I would try to choose a character in general, sometimes I did try to get the character to look more like me, and while I might appear fairly white now, I could be quite tan, so I would go for that look. But that wasn't always the case, and sometimes I wouldn't choose a character that was meant to look like me. And then I'm thinking, are there any other questions in regard to race? And then in terms of how I might address race in the game, again, like many of the other players, I didn't really bring it up explicitly. And that's true too, even within Call of Duty, for example. Now, situating all that I just said about that, I know for a fact that the experience that I had is not necessarily the case for everybody. And in particular, there has been research done, and I forget the authors, but on online video games, and specifically video chat, in relation to race. So, in particular, black identified male character, or male people, I should say, playing online shooting games, when they're identified as black by white players, oftentimes that moment that happens, they'll be called any number of derogatory names, and then they might be removed from a group, for example. And that apparently is, at the time of the research that was done, which was within the past 10 years, I know that much, I don't know the exact date, that's still a prevalent problem.